What's the hardest thing you've had to forgive, or never could?
Every Christmas, without anyone asking or noticing, I pay for everything, and I have done it for years. It started as a small thing, really, a way to make the holidays smoother for my family, because no one likes tension around money at Christmas, and I always had the means to cover it, so I did. I never announced it, never hinted at it, and I always thought that it was understood that my family was close, and that helping them out silently was just part of what we did for each other. I liked it that way. I liked seeing the surprise and relief when the bills were sorted, when the gifts were covered, when no one had to worry about money, because that's how I showed that I cared. I never expected anyone to call it out or recognize it, and that was fine with me because it was never about recognition. It was just about making things easier for everyone. This year, though, something different happened. Something I never expected, something that made me feel like I had been living in a bubble of my own generosity without realizing how disconnected I really was from my family's true feelings. I had just finished transferring money for groceries, decorations, presents, and even a few surprise extras I thought would make the holidays brighter, and I was scrolling through my phone, just mindlessly checking messages, when I noticed a group chat notification I had ignored before because it was just my siblings and cousins joking around. The conversation had a new tone this year, and as I opened it, I froze because the first thing I saw was a message from my older brother James calling me a Santa sucker, followed by Samantha laughing emojis and a few other cousins agreeing with it. I reread it at least 3 times, thinking that maybe I was misunderstanding, but it was all there in plain text, a thread of messages mocking the person who had quietly covered everything for Christmas for years. My heart sank, and I felt a rush of disbelief, followed by anger and a deep, sinking hurt, because the people I trusted, the ones I had thought appreciated my efforts, were actually laughing at me behind my back. I sat there, holding my phone, scrolling through the conversation to see what else they had said, and it kept getting worse. There were messages about how I always overpaid, and how they let her pay for everything again, while they just got to enjoy the free ride. There were even jokes about what they might do if I ever decided not to cover the bills, and I realized in that moment that the past years of quiet generosity had been taken for granted, treated as something foolish or predictable. It was like a veil had been lifted, and I suddenly saw my family in a way I had never really allowed myself to see before, and it hurt more than I thought it could because it wasn't just about the money. It was about the respect I had assumed was mutual and had given freely without question. I kept staring at the phone, feeling the mix of emotions building inside me, because part of me wanted to confront them right then, to demand an apology, to let them know I saw everything, but another part of me, the part that had always been careful, started thinking about what could happen if I reacted too quickly, too emotionally. I realized that whatever I did next would define the rest of this Christmas, and maybe the relationship I had with this family, and I knew I had to be deliberate. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that the only way to regain control, the only way to respond without giving them the satisfaction of seeing me upset, was to plan quietly, to turn the tables in a way that they could never anticipate. I checked my banking app again, making sure that every transaction I had made for this Christmas was secure, every transfer recorded, every bill settled. And then I started to consider the idea that had been forming in the back of my mind ever since I read those messages. What if, instead of confronting them directly, instead of explaining or begging for respect, I let them see exactly what they had counted on without saying a word? What if I took control of the situation in a way that was quiet, deliberate, and irreversible, the same way I had handled their Christmases for years? The thought of it made my chest tighten with a mix of fear and exhilaration, because I knew that this would be the Christmas they would never forget, and that for the first time in years, the power dynamic would shift entirely without me having to yell, cry, or beg for recognition. I put the phone down for a moment, and I just sat there, thinking, realizing that everything I had done, every year I had paid without comment, had been under this assumption of gratitude that did not exist, and now I had the opportunity to correct that misunderstanding forever. I didn't respond to the group chat, I didn't send a single message, and I didn't even look at my bank account again right away, because I wanted to feel the weight of what I had discovered and the clarity of what I was about to do. I knew that this Christmas would not be like the others, that it would be the one where I decided whether to continue giving blindly or to teach them a lesson they would never forget, and that decision rested entirely with me. I finally made a choice, and it wasn't a decision anyone could argue with, because no one knew what I was capable of when I decided it was time to act, and in that moment, I realized that the real gift I could give this Christmas was not more money. Not more presents, but the revelation of what had been happening behind my back, and the quiet satisfaction of finally letting them see it for themselves. I didn't send a single word, I didn't respond to their messages, and I didn't hint that I had read them, but I started preparing, and by the time the evening rolled around, I knew everything would change without me having to say a word. And the thought of that made me feel stronger than I had felt in years. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, turning over every word I had read in that group chat, imagining the laughter, the casual cruelty, and the complete disregard for the years I had quietly sacrificed without a single complaint. And I realized that for the first time, I felt the weight of my own limits pressing down on me, because generosity, no matter how sincere, should not come with humiliation attached, and yet every year I had allowed it to happen, thinking that silence was enough to maintain peace, thinking that my family would appreciate the effort in some unspoken way. I replayed the messages over and over in my mind, each one feeling sharper than the last, and I found myself wondering how I had never noticed the pattern before, how I had never recognized that behind the smiles, the thank yous, and the polite gestures, there had been this quiet expectation that I would always cover everything, that my generosity was a given, a constant they could exploit. Without thought, and the realization hit me with an intensity one had not expected, because it was not just about the money, it was about being seen, being respected, and knowing that the people closest to me had none of that for me. I got out of bed, grabbed my laptop, and started thinking through the logistics of what I could do, because anger alone would not serve me, because if I reacted immediately and impulsively, I would give them the satisfaction of witnessing my upset. And I could not allow that, and I knew that any action I took had to be precise, deliberate, and irreversible, just like I had handled all the Christmas transfers in the past, quietly and efficiently, without fanfare. I started reviewing the bank statements, checking each transaction for the gifts, the groceries, the decorations, the dinners, the small extras I had quietly added because I liked the idea of a perfect Christmas without anyone worrying about the cost. And I realized that every transfer had been executed flawlessly, leaving a trail that I could control, a trail that I could manipulate if I chose to, a trail that could become the proof I needed to shift the balance entirely in my favor without a single confrontation. I knew that if I simply canceled each transfer, if I quietly ensured that nothing went through, and if I kept a record of it, the shock and confusion that would follow when the family realized that the Christmas funds had been reversed would be complete. And the way I imagined their reactions made my chest tighten with anticipation, not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because I wanted them to understand that what they had taken for granted was not endless, that their mockery and entitlement carried consequences, and that the years of silent giving had not gone unnoticed by me, even if it had seemed that way to them. I imagined James and Samantha staring at their accounts in disbelief, wondering why they were suddenly responsible, wondering how it could be possible that the person they had called a joke had been the one quietly holding everything together. And I realized that the power of this revelation would be entirely mine to deliver, carefully, methodically, without any interference or emotional outburst. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that this was not just about Christmas or money, it was about asserting control in a situation where I had been dismissed and underestimated for far too long. About establishing boundaries without having to engage in arguments or explanations, because I knew that if I waited and executed my plan with precision, the results would speak louder than any words I could ever use. And the satisfaction of witnessing their shock from a distance, while remaining silent, would be absolute. I imagined the moment when the transfers failed, the calls, the messages, the frantic attempts to reach me, and I felt a quiet thrill, because for the first time in years, I was not the person being laughed at. I was the one who had orchestrated an outcome they could not anticipate, and that realization made me feel stronger and more focused than I had felt in a very long time. I made a list, a mental checklist of each transfer, each account, and the order in which I would cancel them, making sure that no one would suspect until the moment of revelation, and I considered the timing, the communication, the way each family member would be affected, because I knew that the most satisfying aspect of this plan would be watching them realize their mistake without me having to explain or justify anything, and the idea of them scrambling while I remained completely detached and unreachable made me feel a sense of control and clarity that I had never felt before. I decided that I would start immediately, that I would take each step carefully, quietly, and without revealing any emotion, because if I allowed myself to hesitate or second-guess, the impact would be diminished, and I could not allow that. I finally closed the laptop, feeling the plan settling into my mind like a precise rhythm, and I understood that once I began, there would be no turning back, and the sense of anticipation, of tension, of the power I now held, made every thought, every heartbeat, and every moment feel charged with possibility, because this year, Christmas would be different, and they would finally understand that the person they had ridiculed, the one they had assumed would always cover for them without complaint, had been paying attention all along, and they would learn that their laughter had consequences they had never imagined. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose that I had not felt in years, because the plan I had conceived the night before was clear, deliberate, and completely within my control. And I knew that every step I took now would determine the impact of the revelation I had been waiting to deliver for so long, and the thought of that kept my mind focused and my heart racing even as I went through my usual morning routine, because the satisfaction I anticipated was not something I could ignore or minimize, and I understood that the quiet patience I had maintained for so long was about to pay off in a way that no one could dispute, no matter how much they had mocked me. I sat down at my laptop, opened each account, and started reviewing the transfers one by one, making sure that every detail was correct, every payment aligned with what I had already documented, and every record preserved in case anyone tried to question or dispute what had happened, because I knew that credibility would be essential, that this was not about punishment for the sake of punishment. It was about demonstrating that the trust they assumed I would provide blindly was not endless, and that respect was not optional when it came to years of quiet support. As I began canceling the transfers, I felt a rush of control unlike anything I had experienced before, because every action was deliberate, every click a statement of authority. And the realization that they had no idea what was happening made the experience almost intoxicating, not in a way that was cruel, but in a way that reminded me that power, when exercised thoughtfully and without emotion, could be a form of justice in itself, and that the people who had ridiculed me for years would finally understand that their assumptions about my generosity had consequences they had never anticipated, and I could not stop thinking about their confusion when the first alert from the bank would hit their phones. I kept my phone next to me, ready to respond if absolutely necessary, but part of me knew that silence would be the most effective weapon, because if I reacted to their attempts to reach me, if I sent explanations or reassurances, I would undermine the impact of the moment I had been carefully orchestrating for weeks, even if they had no idea I was thinking so far ahead, and the thought of watching their reactions from a distance, completely unseen, made the tension in my chest tighten with a mix of anticipation and satisfaction, because for the first time, the balance of power was shifting without me having to speak, without me having to confront anyone directly, and the subtle brilliance of the plan lay in its quiet precision, which would hit harder than any argument, any confrontation, any emotional outburst could ever have. As I worked through each transaction, canceling, verifying, and documenting, I found myself thinking back over the years, remembering the countless holidays I had paid for, the subtle disappointment I had ignored, the jokes I had laughed at even when they stung, the way I had sacrificed without asking for recognition, and the slow, simmering realization of betrayal that had brought me to this moment, and I understood that this was not just about money, it was about reclaiming respect, about demonstrating that years of quiet generosity were not an invitation to mock or exploit, and that the people who had underestimated me for so long were about to be confronted with the consequences of their own behavior in a way that they could not anticipate, explain, or deflect. I thought about how the first person would react, probably with disbelief, maybe with a nervous call or a frantic message, and I imagined the ripple effect as each subsequent family member discovered the canceled transfers. And I felt a sense of satisfaction that was both quiet and complete, because I had designed this moment so carefully that there would be no confusion about who held the power, no ambiguity about the reason, and no way for anyone to claim that it had been a mistake. And the more I thought about it, the more I appreciated the artistry of the silence, the subtlety of letting them uncover it on their own while I remained completely outside of their panic, observing in calm control. And knowing that this year's Christmas would not be forgotten, because it would teach a lesson that words alone could never convey, a lesson about respect, entitlement, and the consequences of underestimating someone who has quietly held everything together for years. When I finally finished, I leaned back and let the tension settle in my chest because the transfers were all canceled, the documentation was secure, and I was completely untethered from their expectations, and for the first time in years. I felt a clarity and power that was both liberating and intoxicating because the next move, the revelation, was entirely mine to deliver, and I knew that the shock, the confusion, and the realization of what they had taken for granted would be mine too. Witness in its purest form, completely silent, completely controlled, and completely satisfying, and that thought kept my mind racing with possibilities, because nothing in their past behavior had prepared them for what was about to happen. And the tension in the house, the silence of the impending confrontation, was more thrilling than anything I had imagined possible, and I knew that once they discovered the truth, there would be no going back to the assumptions, the mockery, or the entitlement that had defined our Christmases for years. It started slowly at first, with James sending me a message that seemed polite enough on the surface, asking if there had been a glitch with the bank, but the tone carried that familiar edge of frustration that I had learned to recognize over the years. And I could feel the tension building already, even though I had not replied, because I knew that as soon as one person realized what had happened, the rest would quickly follow, and the ripple effect would be immediate, unavoidable, and irreversible, which was exactly what I had intended, and I sat back quietly, watching from a distance as my decision began to manifest in real time, knowing that their confusion would grow as they tried to piece together what had happened without any explanation from me, and the satisfaction of that alone was intoxicating, because finally, for the first time, the power was entirely mine. By mid-morning, Samantha called, her voice strained, almost frantic, trying to mask her irritation with forced calm, and every word she said carried the undertone of disbelief, as if she could not comprehend that the person they had mocked, the person they had assumed would always cover every expense without hesitation, had deliberately changed the outcome, and I stayed silent, listening without responding, letting her panic build with each question, each accusation that was half joke and half serious demand for an explanation, and I could feel the tension in the air, even through the phone, because I knew that neither of them had anticipated that I would act so deliberately, and the more they tried to reach me, the more I understood that my silence was more effective than anything I could have said, because their frustration, confusion, and helplessness would deliver a lesson no words ever could. Messages started flooding in, some polite, some accusing, and I noticed the subtle shift in tone from disbelief to panic, the realization slowly dawning that their assumptions about my generosity had been built on convenience and entitlement rather than gratitude, and as I watched this unfold, I felt a deep, almost calming sense of justice that had nothing to do with anger, but everything to do with asserting control over a situation that had been completely one-sided for years, because every Christmas, I had quietly absorbed the costs, the planning, the stress, and the ridicule without complaint, and this was the first time that they were confronting the consequences of that behavior, and it was entirely of my making. By mid-afternoon, I began receiving group messages, not directly to me, but in the family chat, the same one where they had called me Santa Sucker, and the tone was frantic, incredulous, a mix of panic, disbelief, and awkward attempts to coordinate and figure out who was responsible, and I felt a sharp satisfaction knowing that they had no idea that I was behind every canceled transfer, no idea that I had orchestrated this with precision, and no way to predict how I would respond, if at all. And I kept myself calm, letting the storm unfold around me, knowing that my silence amplified the impact, because without my confirmation, their panic became exponential, and each message they sent only reinforced the reality that they had finally underestimated me. I thought about the years I had kept this secret, quietly absorbing the cost of their celebrations without comment, always expecting nothing in return except perhaps acknowledgement, which I had rarely received. And I realized that the quiet humiliation I had endured had prepared me for this moment, because patience, careful planning, and attention to detail allowed me to execute a response that was elegant, devastating in its effect, and entirely justifiable in my mind. And as the family scrambled to make sense of the cancellations, I felt an odd mixture of relief and exhilaration, because this was not about revenge in the petty sense. It was about demonstrating that entitlement has limits, and that when those limits are crossed, the consequences can be precise, quiet, and irreversible. By evening, the panic had reached its peak, with frantic calls, text chains, and private messages flooding every device, and I finally made my move, sending a single message to the group chat, a proof of the canceled transfers, without commentary, without explanation, letting the evidence speak for itself. And then, after sending it, I did something I had never done before. I went completely offline, knowing that the chaos, confusion, and realization would unfold entirely on its own, and as I shut down my devices, I felt the clarity and satisfaction of someone who had finally asserted control, who had turned the tables, and who, for the first time, was completely untethered from the expectations and mockery that had dominated every Christmas for years, and I knew that from this moment forward, nothing would be the same. After sending the proof of the canceled transfers, I closed my laptop and put my phone down, knowing that the next few hours would define the impact of what I had done, and for the first time in years, I felt completely untethered from the expectations, the ridicule, and the assumptions that had dominated every family gathering, because the power was no longer abstract or imagined. It was real, immediate, and entirely mine to observe from a distance, and the quiet thrill of that realization was stronger than any anticipation I had felt in the days leading up to this moment, because unlike anything I had experienced before, this was not about confrontation or argument. It was about controlled, deliberate truth delivered with a precision that could not be disputed. I did not check my messages immediately, because I knew that impatience would only dilute the effect, and I wanted the revelation to hit each person in its own time, in the order that the chaos naturally unfolded. And when I finally glanced at my phone hours later, I could see the fallout, the ripple effect, cascading through texts, calls, and private messages, all of them frantic, incredulous, tinged with panic, disbelief, and the kind of silent self-questioning that comes when people realize they have underestimated someone completely. And I realized that I had created something far more powerful than any confrontation could have achieved, because the impact was multiplying organically, and there was nothing anyone could do to reverse it. No explanation, no rationalization, no attempt to appeal to me that would undo what had been set into motion. I watched the messages and calls come in, the initial anger slowly turning into an awkward silence as people realized that I had orchestrated everything with complete control, that the years of quiet generosity had never been weakness, and that my patience and consistency had been misinterpreted as a license for mockery, entitlement, and casual disrespect. And I felt a deep, almost calming satisfaction knowing that I had forced them to confront the consequences of their own assumptions without saying a single word, without confrontation, and without giving anyone the opportunity to deflect or manipulate the narrative, because the facts were now in their hands, and they had nowhere to go, no one to blame, and no way to undo the lesson I had delivered with calculated silence. By late evening, the group chat had become a place of tense reflection, confusion, and forced acknowledgement, with messages that shifted from frantic accusations to hesitant attempts at understanding. as if they were trying to process how someone they had ridiculed for years could take control so completely, and I felt a quiet thrill at the clarity of their realization, because it confirmed everything I had planned, every detail I had considered, every decision I had made in private to ensure that the lesson was unmistakable, effective, and entirely undeniable. And the more I observed, the more I understood that the impact would linger long after the messages stopped coming, because the proof was undeniable and the lesson permanent. I spent the night offline, letting the chaos run its course, feeling a mixture of relief and triumph as the family processed the reality of what I had done, and in the quiet hours, I realized that this moment was about far more than money, gifts, or the holiday itself. It was about asserting boundaries, reclaiming respect, and demonstrating that patience, consistency, and control were powerful tools when wielded deliberately, and that people who assume entitlement at the expense of generosity will eventually confront the consequences of that assumption in ways they cannot predict, manage, or mitigate. And the knowledge that I had orchestrated this entirely on my own, without anyone realizing until the last second, filled me with a sense of mastery and quiet satisfaction that no words could capture. By the time I finally checked the last messages the next morning, the panic had subsided into hesitant apologies, awkward acknowledgments, and stunned realizations, none of which diminished the effect of what I had achieved, because the lesson was complete. The reversal total and the power dynamic had permanently shifted in a way that they could neither challenge nor ignore, and as I closed the phone and let the silence settle, I felt an unprecedented clarity and calm, because this Christmas, unlike any before, I had turned the tables, claimed control, and demonstrated that respect cannot be assumed, generosity cannot be exploited, and that calculated patience, executed with precision and restraint, can be far more powerful than confrontation. And as I walked away from the notifications, knowing I would remain offline for the rest of the day, I understood with a sense of quiet triumph that this was the kind of victory that lingers, subtle yet absolute, and no one would ever forget. The lesson I had delivered without a single word spoken.